Western Hemisphere had never seen any action to equal what's taking place at Antietam.
Thousands of men killed, and they're just shot down in heaps.
People are appalled by the casualties. They just annihilated each other.
It was a battle ultimately about casualties and destruction. I mean, one after another, one after another, one after another.
It is impossible to visualize the carnage.
That the battle was fought along Antietam Creek is head-shaking. As one writer has said, Sharpsburg was not much of a town, Antietam was not much of a creek, and Lee's army was not much of a force. And yet, here at Sharpsburg, they will fight this enormous battle. And it was basically because Lee took a stand here.
Abraham Lincoln rose on the morning of September 17th, 1862, still very much in mourning. Willie, his 10-year-old son, had contracted typhoid fever the previous winter. After 2 weeks of illness, he succumbed. The president periodically shut himself off in a White House room. Alone, he would cry. But the loss of Willie was not all that weighed on Lincoln that September morning. Robert E. Lee, with his Army of Northern Virginia, had invaded Maryland only a few weeks earlier. For the first time, the war between the states had come north.
No president has carried a greater burden than Abraham Lincoln. He's managing both personal tragedy and this enormous national crisis. And it's very hard to understand how he kept at it in some ways. It's a tremendous period of burden and trial for him. The late summer and early fall of 1862 was a very problematical time for the United States because the Confederacy was on a winning streak in Virginia. Robert E. Lee had won 2 big victories, the 7 Days and Second Bull Run, and these 2 victories had given the appearance that the Confederacy was winning the war. Lincoln could not afford to have another major defeat.
If I'm a play-by-play announcer and I'm calling the game, as it were, the South's up by 20 at halftime, at that moment. I think everybody in the North is concerned one way or another that this war wasn't over quickly. It's going very badly for the North. I think they're concerned that they're going to lose the war, that we're going to end up 2 separate nations.
In the summer of 1862, Union victory was far from inevitable. In fact, for many, it seemed impossible. The 11 Confederate states had a functioning government and controlled most of their territory. To win the war, the South needed only to defend what it already possessed. Invading the North was not only unnecessary, it was risky. And yet, in September 1862, this is exactly what Lee did.
He wanted to impress the Northern people with the fact that their armies weren't being successful. Lee knew the key to victory was persuading the civilian population of the United States that the war wasn't worth it.
There's every reason to believe in the late summer of 1862, as the North, as the Union government is for the first time instituting a draft in order to supply its armies, that this war is becoming unpopular, and Lee knows that as well. But Lee is not unaware of the possibility of British intervention.
The threat of foreign intervention in the American Civil War was one of the most pressing questions in the summer of 1862. Both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis knew that the French had made victory in the Revolutionary War possible. Without France, there would be no United States. The question was, would the British do the same for the Confederacy?
The British Empire was an empire built on the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution was built on cotton. Cotton was the white gold of the transatlantic economy. The British feel threatened by the American Civil War because the American Civil War disrupts that supply of cotton in the same way that today we would feel a disruption in the supply of oil. The British have to have the supply of cotton resumed, But what will be the basis on which they intervene? What will be the excuse?
Well, the key for the British and the French is the Confederacy going to win? They don't want to back a loser. Lee's victories at the 7 Days and Second Bull Run persuaded the British. The French were already ready to move, but persuaded the British that one more victory would indicate that the Confederacy was going to win.
Britain, however, had not yet endorsed Southern independence, in part because slavery had been abolished in its empire. For many, recognition of the Confederacy was too great a moral compromise.
They've abolished slavery in the British Empire, and on the one hand, they want to support the South because they need the cotton. But if England is also a land of freedom and abolition, to say that we will support the South also says that we will support a slave nation.
Abraham Lincoln famously said back in the late 1850s that this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. He's known that for a very, very long time. But he is shackled by the United States Constitution that not only condones slavery, but slavery is legal. It is permitted by the United States Constitution.
Southerners knew that they could not win without their slaves. Lincoln, it took him time to realize that he could not win unless he took those slaves away from them.
Abraham Lincoln had long held that the Civil War was first and foremost about preserving the Union. Ending slavery simply was not the reason he waged war. In fact, Lincoln held fast to the hope that he could restore the Union through compromise, even if that compromise meant slavery would be left intact. But as the war dragged on, it was clear that this was an impossible position. A house divided would not stand. Either the Union or the institution of slavery would prevail. And so, in the summer of 1862, Abraham Lincoln finally embraced freedom.
Well, in the third week of July, Lincoln actually showed a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, to his cabinet.
And the first response that he gets from his cabinet is dead silence. They are not entirely sure that the war record of the Army is going to make that proclamation look like anything except whistling into the wind. If Lincoln issues an Emancipation Proclamation now, instead of it looking like a dramatic testimony to freedom, it's going to look like a last desperate play of the last desperate card of a cause that is lost.
And then Secretary of State Seward stands up and says, "Mr. President, yes, but not now. Yes, but we have to wait for a victory." He said, if we issue the Emancipation Proclamation right now, and I'm just fascinated, I love these words, it will sound like the last shriek on the retreat. We must wait for a victory. And with that logic, Abraham Lincoln finally agreed.
After meeting with his cabinet, Lincoln placed a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in one of the pigeonholes of his stand-up desk. There it sat for the rest of the summer, waiting for a Union victory.
That morning, it came in very slow. It had rained the night before, and both armies were crouched, and around dawn, objects began to become visible in the early morning light, and some picket fired a musket, and that was almost a signal gun.
The Battle of Antietam began just after the dawn of September 17, 1862, with a Union attack on the Confederate left flank. Almost immediately, its focal point became a 30-acre patch of corn.
The battle opens on the northern end of the field, and Union Corps Commander Joseph Hooker's part of the field with his soldiers at first striking south, and their focal point becomes a cornfield owned by a man named Miller, where some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war takes place.
Let's remember, this is mid-September. This is a cornfield where the corn is higher than a man's head. They are ordered to march directly through a cornfield. as best they can, walking between the rows and trying to hold their ranks. What's going to be at the other end? You know that probably the Confederate Army is going to be at the other end. You're told to stay in line, to shoulder up to one another. And as is always the case in this kind of warfare, if somebody falls next to you, you shoulder up to the next guy.
And how do you get men to do that? How do you get men to do that? To stand together in great gigantic boxes of men, shoulder to shoulder, and marching into the jaws of the dragon? How do you get people to do that? Well, the American Civil War is frequently referred to as brother against brother, and that's true. But far more common was brother alongside of brother. So that in these great big boxes of men, if the guy standing here is your brother, and the guy standing here is your father, to turn and run is not an option. You're not going to abandon your brother on the battlefield. Given the choice of fight or flight in that situation, death is the preferred option.
Those thousands of men marching through that cornfield that morning end up marching into musket fire from the Confederate side, utter confusion, blindness from the smoke and the mist and the fog, and they are slaughtered by the hundreds. But that's the way the Battle of Antietam would be for the next 8 to 9 hours.
Robert E. Lee never intended to fight a decisive battle in western Maryland. Instead, he wrote of advancing as far north as Pennsylvania. But events beyond his control would halt Lee's advance at Sharpsburg, Maryland, where he would decide to make his stand. To the south of Antietam lay the Union garrison of Harper's Ferry. When Lee marched into Maryland in early September, he presumed the Union would abandon Harper's Ferry and move north to protect Pennsylvania. Instead, the North held its ground.
So now Lee is well into Maryland, and I've got to do something about that. They are sitting on my lines of communications. They're sitting on my lines of resupply. I've got to get rid of that spur under my saddle.
In response, Lee broke his army into 4 sections. 3 columns were sent under the command of Stonewall Jackson to take Harper's Ferry. Lee remained at Frederick, Maryland. In an abundance of caution, Lee sent his Special Order 191 detailing his plan to his key generals, one of which remarkably fell into the hands of the commander of the Union Army, George McClellan.
A young Indiana private finds these orders wrapped around these cigars laying on the ground and sitting in McClellan's tent were Lee's orders to his commanding his corps commanders by September the 14th.
It was the greatest security leak in American military history. McClellan not only knew that Lee's army was divided, he knew where the sections were, he knew when they were coming together, and most importantly, McClellan was closer to either one of the Confederate sections than they were to each other. Never has an American military commander been beneficiary of more great intelligence than McClellan was at Frederick, Maryland.
George McClellan was as reticent, as conservative as Robert E. Lee was daring. He was the kind of general who was better at making excuses than war. The weather was no good, the roads too muddy. The enemy surely outnumbered him. Lincoln famously said of McClellan, "He has a case of the slows."
Lincoln was willing to put up with McClellan if McClellan could give him victories. When McClellan didn't give him a victory in the 7 days, he put him on the shelf. But the problem for Lincoln is there isn't a long line of men able to command armies waiting outside the White House gates.
McClellan was a wonderful organizer, and the Army of the Potomac, which he created, was his. By the time that army staggered back into Washington from failure on the peninsula and failure to support Pope at Second Manassas, it had a real morale problem. And thus, early in September, with Lee driving into Maryland, Lincoln restored McClellan to supreme command. and the soldiers greeted him like a long-lost father.
The shout went up, Mac is back. 3 cheers for McClellan. The morale of that army that was as low as it could possibly go in one instant was as high as it could possibly be the next. He inspired this army. They were ready right then and there to turn around and fight again. That was something that George McClellan brought to the army that nobody else could have.
And yet, even when the authenticity of Lee's orders was confirmed, McClellan once again failed to take decisive action.
He lets the 15th go by. The 16th goes by with only light skirmishing. 2 full days drag by without his pressing the issue with Lee. That gives Lee an opportunity to bring up the soldiers from Harper's Ferry. And by the end of the day on the 16th and through that night, and early morning on the 17th, the soldiers on both sides knew that something was going to happen the next day, that there would be a big fight.
Ready!
After the first hour of fighting on September 17, the corn on the Miller farm had been obliterated. Wave after wave of advancing soldiers, tens of thousands on both sides, attacked and counterattacked. By one account, this 30-acre patch of corn changed hands 15 times.
It's disorganized, it's chaotic, it is loud. The thousands of muskets, the roar of the artillery.
People shouting and cursing and officers yelling, and it would be a din, and it would be very hard for anyone really to control this process once it got going.
While the fighting is going on, officers trying to communicate with each other would often have to go up to each other and cup their hands together and yell directly into each other's ears just to be heard. And sometimes even that didn't do it. Sometimes even at that, orders were misunderstood.
The killing is just intense, it's disorganized. These men are just going down in incredible fashion. Dead bodies everywhere.
The cornfield would have been a terrible place to be. If you're in the rear ranks, you can't really see your opponents until they're very close to you. If you're in the front ranks doing the attacking, you're going to be met with these withering volleys of musketry with no chance to respond, really.
You have them coming in like waves, like ocean waves. You have a front line coming in, and then you have coming in on the left, another line. And then you have coming in on the right, another line. Then you have coming in reserve, another line. So it's just line after line, mass after mass moving forward.
It's like 2 fighters with no defense, with their hands by their sides. I'll hit you and now you hit me.
It's assault upon assault upon assault, and yet they continue to slug it out through that area through most of the morning.
Only when the Confederates essentially run out of units to feed into the fight, and there are still Union units coming in, that the weight of Union numbers tells, and that gives, in the end, the Federals control of the cornfield.
After 3 hours of battle, 9,000 Union and Confederate men had either been killed or wounded in an orgy of violence. And yet, there were still 2 more horrific phases of the battle to be fought. In the fall of 1862, Robert E. Lee invaded the North with the hope of ending the war between the states. After the Union debacles on the Virginia Peninsula and its second Bull Run, Lee knew that one more decisive Southern victory could break Northern will, especially if it occurred on federal soil.
The state of Maryland was a border state. The state of Maryland was a slave state. The state of Maryland was, in their view, in the South's view, being held in the Union against its will. Abraham Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus there to keep Maryland in the Union. Think of the geography of Maryland. If Maryland seceded from the Union, then Washington, D.C. is totally contained within the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln cannot let Maryland go. Robert E. Lee and others in the South are under what turned out to be the false impression that once his army marched into Maryland, that the state of Maryland would rise up in arms, join the Confederacy, surround Washington, D.C., and war's over.
The young guys would come to the Confederate camp and with interest in signing up until they saw Lee's troops. Lee's troops had no underwear. Many of them were barefoot. They were living on apples and corn and whatever they could forage from the countryside.
The Army of Northern Virginia was always hungry, and that was not an exception when they came to Maryland. They were still hungry because Western Marylanders did not accept them with open arms as Lee and others had anticipated.
The assumptions of Lee's campaign proved false. There was no uprising against the Lincoln administration, no new flow of men into his army. Instead, the Confederates were viewed by the people of Western Maryland for what they were, invaders. And so, when North and South met near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, Lee had only 40,000 men to oppose McClellan's 60,000, a huge disadvantage that almost proved fatal for the Confederacy. After the early morning's brutal fighting in the cornfield, the Battle of Antietam shifted to the center of the Confederate line, along a stretch of sunken road.
The sunken road is a road where the ground actually has depressed as a result of erosion caused by traffic over the years. Because it sinks into the ground, the Confederates could get into this lane and literally stand up and have cover. The bank of the road would help provide them with cover. So the Confederates are ready. Their weapons are loaded. They're in position. They're in their ranks. And they're waiting.
Over that hill, you can hear them coming. You can hear the officers giving orders. About that point, you pull your hammer back to the full cocked position and you're ready, and you look up over that hill, and first thing you see is the golden eagles on top of the flagstaffs. And then you see the beginnings of the flags, and then you see the tips of the bayonets, and then you begin to see the soldiers themselves as they come up marching shoulder to shoulder.
As the Federal soldiers come over the hill, they are silhouetted against the sky. It's a perfect target. And coming down that hill, it was bare ground. There's simply no place to hide or take shelter.
One Confederate general said, "Aim for their belt buckles." Fire! And the entire line of Union troops fell. But then they never stopped coming. Here comes another, and here comes another, and here comes another, and they just keep coming and coming and coming.
And the fighting goes on and on between the sunken road itself and the hillside. It was insanity. It was Dante's Inferno come alive. You see just vicious combat taking place. Men were shouting and cursing at the enemy as they loaded their weapons. Others were simply growling like animals, all in the name of patriotism and duty.
Ultimately, the Union forces got alongside of the sunken road, and so now they're firing through a straight line.
When people get on their flanks, the sunken road becomes a great killing ground because the Federals can shoot down the length of it, and it's very hard for the Confederates to scramble out. And here you have a slaughter on the part of the Confederate defenders.
So the Confederates begin retreating from the lane. I mean, now they're running. This is not a very orderly retreat. They are trying to get out of there as fast as they can, and many, many of them are being shot down in the open ground once they're outside of that lane.
As the Confederate line wilted, a Union commander with the 5th New Hampshire cried out, "Give them the war whoop." His men responded with such a frenzied chant but they drowned out the deafening thunder of their guns.
Word goes back to Union headquarters from the officers on the scene. Give us reinforcements. We've broken through the rebel army. McClellan had achieved exactly what he said he wanted to achieve, and this is where Lee's army really was right on the edge of a catastrophic failure.
McClellan is leading the casualty reports. He doesn't like what he's seeing. He's still fearful of defeat, not looking toward victory, so he calls off the attack about noon.
Had McClellan exploited that success, had he sent in some of his reserves, he had an entire corps, an entire infantry corps, Fitzjohn Porter's 5th Corps, near at hand, and he almost roused himself to do something. McClellan edged perilously close to decisive action. It's quite a moment in his life. But just as he was about to act, Fitzjohn Porter very helpfully reminded him that Porter's corps was the last reserve of the last army of the Republic, and that was enough to remind McClellan that caution was better than aggressiveness, and so he pulled back, and the fighting fizzled out in this second phase.
McClellan's famous caution was not just because he was such a great organizer of troops, was not just because he didn't want to spend the blood of his men, but it's also because he does not want to prosecute a war that will ultimately threaten Southern institutions.
He wanted to defeat the rebels by inflicting the least possible damage to them, beat them just enough to persuade them to come back into the old United States, and then we'll be friends again and we'll move forward as we were before the war. He doesn't understand that that's not possible anymore.
Legend has it that after the Battle of Antietam, an elderly woman from the town of Sharpsburg rode onto the battlefield in her carriage. When she came to the sunken road, she stopped and looked at the dead in and alongside the road. Then she got down on her knees and asked God to bless those who had died in what she called this bloody lane. By mid-afternoon, the Antietam battlefield was silent, the Union and Confederate armies exhausted. Both had taken staggering losses, with no clear victor. And yet there was still to be one last brutal stand, one final chance for decisive victory.
There's one more phase of the battle to come, that in the southern sector, and again, the United States soldiers push Lee right to the very edge because there's hardly anybody left down there on the Confederate side. Just a few hundred Georgians and 12,500 soldiers under Burnside.
General Ambrose Burnside was in command of the Union's left flank on the banks of the Antietam Creek. Throughout the bloody morning, Burnside and his men sat poised, ready to engage the rebel army. Now it fell to them to give Abraham Lincoln the decisive victory he so desperately needed. At the extreme southern end of the battlefield lay the last remnant of Lee's army, just 3,000 men. Standing between them and Burnside was Antietam Creek.
The distance between victory and defeat was that bridge. It was the closest bridge to Sharpsburg. It had to be defended. And so these Georgians are sitting there. Burnside sends his soldiers forward, coming across that one-lane stone bridge. And the Confederates up on the hill have a turkey shoot.
Burnside attacked the bridge with only a fraction of his corps. His main objective was to ford the Antietam, downriver, and outflank the Georgian skirmishers. But his plan took hours longer than expected. By then, the bridge had been taken.
In the end, 2 regiments dashed across the bridge, straight across the bridge, in effect, under fire, took casualties, and established what we should call a beachhead on the Confederate side of Antietam Creek. Once they did that, The Georgians' position was hopeless because there simply weren't enough of them.
Burnside outnumbers him 3-1. Burnside's men are moving. I mean, Lee has to see that it's just about over.
Lee is helpless. There's nothing Lee can do once that line breaks because it's just a question of the Federal Army curling around his flank.
Lee had no reserves. Behind him lay the Potomac River. If Burnside could cut off Lee's retreat, take the town of Sharpsburg, the future of the Confederacy would be in doubt. Fate, however, was not with the Union Army.
When it seems critical that Burnside just may be ready to cross the Sharpsburg Road, turn Lee's flank, bring the Army of Northern Virginia to destruction, off in the distance there's a gray cloud. That's a dust cloud. And Lee looks over in great apprehension. If they are Federals, the cause is lost. And he asks who they are, and finally he's told it's A.P. Hill's division.
In a fashion that maybe even Hollywood wouldn't risk, Confederate units come up at the 59th minute of the 11th hour. The last division from Harper's Ferry, the one that Stonewall Jackson left behind to oversee all the prisoners and all the loot the Confederates captured there. It's under Ambrose Powell Hill. They've made a strong 17-mile march. About half of them have fallen out of ranks on the way, but the remnant of that division comes onto the field in exactly the right place at exactly the right time.
Wham! Here comes Hill out of nowhere, smashes into Burnside's left flank, completely carries Burnside by surprise, completely stalls the advance of the Union Army. It is a near miracle.
Hill had put on one gigantic accomplishment that day, and A.P. Hill turned the war around for another 2 years.
Darkness arrives on the evening of the 17th, shortly after 7:30 in the evening, and finally the firing stops.
The guns quiet down with the setting of the sun, and then there's a more heart-wrenching noise that begins. It's the screams and hollering and moans of thousands upon thousands of soldiers lying upon the field.
You know what? When it gets dark, you can't tell the difference between blue and gray. They look exactly the same.
The Battle of Antietam was a draw. Neither Union nor Confederate army had moved significantly from the positions held at dawn, at an unimaginable cost. 23,000 lay either dead or wounded, more than 9 times the number of men who fell on the beaches of Normandy. But this staggering loss would not pass without meaning, for in the aftermath of Antietam, America would be reborn. In October 1862, Matthew Brady posted a sign on the door of his New York gallery. It read simply, "The Dead of Antietam." Inside were images unlike anything America had ever witnessed. The New York Times wrote of the exhibition, "The dead of the battlefield come up to us very rarely, even in dreams. We see the list in the morning paper at breakfast, but dismiss its recollection with the coffee." Mr. Brady, however, has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along our streets, he has done something very like it. 23,000 men, Union and Confederate, had either been killed or wounded at Antietam. And yet, for all the carnage, there was no decisive battlefield victor. At the end of the day's fighting, the Union held the high ground at the cornfield, the Bloody Lane, and Burnside Bridge. Lee gathered his remaining men and waited for McClellan's attack the next morning. It never came. One day later, Lee retreated unhindered back into Virginia.
McClellan doesn't follow up when he could have. When Lee's army escapes, people are baffled. Lincoln is beside himself. I sent you to get Lee's army, not to run him out of Maryland, but to get the army.
But remember, the Emancipation Proclamation is sitting in his desk drawer. He is desperate for a victory. And what has happened in Maryland is that an invasion of the North has been repulsed.
The rebels do retreat. And to someone living in New York or Ohio, they read their newspaper, the rebels retreated. That's a victory. It's not the kind of victory Lincoln hoped for, thought was possible, but it's certainly enough of a victory for him to issue his preliminary proclamation.
What comes out of Antietam that is most important, of course, is the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation issued 5 days after the end of the battle, the 22nd of September.
On September 22nd, Lincoln called a special meeting of his cabinet. He announced that Antietam offered an indication of divine will to proceed with emancipation, adding simply, "God has decided this question in favor of the slaves."
The war began, of course, as a simple fight over preserving the Union. Is the 75-year-old United States to survive, or are we to go back to a confederated state of government? But as the war continues, I think Mr. Lincoln came to the conclusion that there was something much bigger to this war than merely preserving the Union, that this war might in essence be the recreation of a United States with freedom replacing slavery.
However radical the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was careful not to overstep the Constitution, which still countenanced slavery. He drew instead on his legal powers as Commander-in-Chief to confiscate enemy property, in this case, the South's slaves.
The Emancipation Proclamation does not technically free anyone. It frees slaves in territory that the Union does not control. That's the important technicality. The important reality is that slaves take it to mean more than it is. They give it meaning. The proclamation confirms for slaves that this war is what they said it was from the beginning, that to go to war for union with or without slavery, that was a ridiculous proposition. Now it is a war for freedom. Union victory means emancipation.
Now, if the Confederacy loses, if the Lincoln administration is in charge when the war ends, slavery is going to be dead. That means the entire social fabric of the Confederacy is now on the table in this war. It's not going to be a war that ends with Humpty Dumpty being put back together.
Before Antietam, the great powers of Europe were on the verge of recognizing Confederate independence. In fact, on the very day of Antietam, Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, decided that one more Confederate victory would allow England to intervene on the side of the South. McClellan's victory stalled that decision. Lincoln's proclamation made it impossible.
It stops England and France dead in their tracks. They cannot come into the war to support a slaveholding nation when both empires, British and French, had only recently liberated their own slaves.
George McClellan believed that he had saved the Union at Antietam. "I fought the battle splendidly," he wrote to his wife. "It was a masterpiece of art." Abraham Lincoln did not agree. He was despondent that Lee had been allowed to escape. In the days after the battle, he traveled to Antietam to urge McClellan into action. When McClellan resisted, Lincoln removed him from command of the Army of the Potomac, this time permanently. After the setback of Antietam, Robert E. Lee continued his brilliant battlefield successes. At Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Lee badly beat the Union Army. Then, in June 1863, Lee once again decided to take the war north, this time to Gettysburg.
There's a sense in which the Battle of Gettysburg is Antietam Part 2. Take the war out of Virginia, take it into the North. He didn't succeed in doing that at Antietam, but he comes back the next year and he has exactly the same strategy in mind. At Gettysburg, that strategy meets its final and definitive defeat. And Lincoln, when he goes to dedicate the Gettysburg Cemetery in the November following the Battle of Gettysburg, he articulates what really could be a statement that addresses both Gettysburg and Antietam. That the struggle at Antietam, the struggle at Gettysburg, both are about this new birth of freedom.
Antietam and Gettysburg are connected. The preliminary proclamation sets in motion events that make it possible for Lincoln's great statement in the Gettysburg Address that the war is for union and freedom, for a new birth of freedom. The Gettysburg Address follows through on the promise of Antietam, what became possible in the wake of Antietam.
Fourscore-and-7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.